Hello and welcome to a sullen Easter question and answer session as part of the English Shared Futures 2020 online version. My name is Rachel Roberts. I am a PGCE tutor for the secondary English programme at the University of Reading, and it is my delight to be able to interview Barbara Bleiman, who I hope you have heard of. Barbara is a former head of English. She has worked for over 40 years in English teaching in the secondary level and A-level. She has been heavily involved in CPD and as a consultant in the area of English. She is former co-director of the English and Media Centre, which is located in North London, and she is currently co-editor of their e-magazine publication. Barbara has been hugely influential in the realm of supporting teachers over the last few decades. Last year, she was recipient of the NATE 2019 Award for Outstanding Contributions for English Teaching. And she's also a published author, has written 2 novels which have been published, Accidents of Love and Off the Vortrekker Road, which is partly a family history of Barbara's family from South Africa. She's written numerous study guides and most recently her book on teaching of English at secondary level called What Matters in English Teaching. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Barbara to this online, slightly strange question and answer session. Yes, thank you, Barbara, and thank you for everything you've done and you continue to do for English teachers and the English teaching community in the UK. My first question is actually going back to maybe your beginnings, if you like, as an English teacher. What inspired you to become an English teacher in the first place?
Right, well, a lovely, interesting question. I had experiences of English teaching in my own schooling, which were very influential, but perhaps not in a particularly brilliant way, in that I had the same English teacher from the start of secondary through till finishing my O-levels. And well, I'll give you a little flavour of it by telling you something about the very first writing that I did with my homework and gave in. And the response on it was, I think, probably something like a kind of B- or a C+ or something like that. And then the comment, too imaginative. That gives you a sort of flavour of what my education was like, because thereafter, for 5 years, it continued with parsing sentences, comprehension exercises, highly canonical but very boring set of texts to study. I think the kind of highlight of my time was possibly pushing all the desks to one side and enacting little bits of Androcles and the Lion. So this was English for me. But at the same time, sort of at home and in my home life, it was incredibly important to me. So dull as ditch water at school, fantastically important to me at home. I was reading poetry, I was reading novels. It was a boring period where there were no mobile phones, etc. And I'd spend whole summer holidays reading, basically, and writing. And then in the sixth form, everything transformed. Fantastic teachers who suddenly, it was a kind of less is more thing. Rather than telling you everything, they made space for thinking, for ideas. They went off-piste and back on again. And it was a real kind of eye-opener about what English for study could be. I went on and then did a good degree in English, and those sort of memories of education and of what English was like really stayed with me and were important to me. And I wanted to be the kind of English teacher who could make that difference for students. I went on and then did a PGC at the Institute of Education, and it was also a real eye-opener for me how fantastically intellectually stimulating that course was. I mean, I wouldn't say it was more stimulating than reading medieval literature and 18th century novels, etc., at Oxford, but in a different way, absolutely equally so, reading Vygotsky, and thinking about how language works and how students learn and all of those things was just brilliant. So that was my way in, really, and I went straight into working in inner city comprehensives and absolutely loved it.
So those are kind of formative experiences.
Yeah. Formative experiences, but perhaps even, strangely, the negative ones influencing me more than the positive ones, in the sense that I knew that this subject could be different, and with a different set of approaches, and actually bringing the student into the process more, and being interested in what students had to think, could really, really bring it alive for students. And I wanted to be involved in that. It's a very exciting thing to be doing.
Absolutely, thank you. I think that seems to run through, I think, a lot of your writing, and certainly in your book, What Matters in English Teaching. So thinking about that, kind of the length of time you've been involved in the teaching of English, and in different capacities as well, what kinds of changes have you seen over that time, and where do you feel the subject is at the moment?
Right, well, if you'd asked me sort of like 6 months or 9 months ago, I probably would have said I feel very, very depressed and bleak about the subject. But I think things are sort of changing a little bit at the moment, and in a good way. But I mean, comparing sort of my early period of the experiences of my early time teaching, I think the major change has been this development of an accountability culture for teachers, that has taken away their agency and taken away their sense of being able to be adaptive and responsive to student thinking and ideas, and individual contexts, and has replaced that with a very highly kind of formulaic, routinized kind of approach to the subject. And teachers, at the period at which I was a head of department, or I was active even as a young teacher actually, when I started out, English teachers had a lot more kind of authority and control over what they were doing. And I know that in a good English department, the head of English could be counted on, really, to sort of talk about the subject to senior management in ways that would influence the way the subject was then taught. I mean, we were often saying, no, actually our subject's just not like that. We can't assess it in these ways. And that kind of power seems to have been lost very much. There are all sorts of reasons for that, I think, which I go into in the book, but that makes a very big difference. So what we're seeing now, I think, is kind of approaches to the subject that bear little relation to how the subject is seen in its wider discipline, what it meant to me as a younger teacher, and that's because, I think, over time, all sorts of school-based approaches have kind of taken over. So if I think for academics going into English classrooms, or who have children who are studying, you often hear that sort of sense of, well, what on earth is this thing? It doesn't seem very much like the kind of English we know. So the idea, for instance, that English is a subject which is all to do with the unknown and the unknowable, ambiguity, uncertainty, and that's where interpretation, and that's the terrain we're working in. That seems to have been lost. That seems to be so fundamental to English, and yet it seems to have been lost. So teachers have been encouraged to give right and wrong answers, to sort of set out set forms, set ways of doing things. In answering a question, often you'll see a whole class of students being sort of told to, or being offered the same quotation, for instance, to back up the same idea. rather than there being this sort of sense of multiple and complex and kind of ways of thinking about a text that kind of come partly from personal response, but then validated through evidence and so forth. But not everybody's saying the same thing. That isn't the subject, and I think that's what we've seen happening. And connected to that, just I say one other thing, which is really important to me, and I think it's important in the book. It's important in everything I do. Really, is that the voice of the student, the student's presence should be taken seriously and respected, and they have things to offer. They're not full of gaps and deficits and cultural emptiness, which is how we've started to see them. And it's really, really interesting to me when teachers have been trying out some of the things that EMC offers, EMC where I work, offers, which are a bit more open and leave more flexibility to students. They're really, really surprised at what their students come up with. And that, for me, it shouldn't be a surprise. We should be capitalising on all of this in every lesson with our students. We should be making that space to know what's going on in their cultural lives, in their attitudes to school, in what they think of what we're doing with them, and so on.
Okay, thank you. It occurred to me as you were talking that perhaps that distance between undergraduate study, maybe particularly in literature, and what perhaps goes on in secondary schools. Do you think that applies all the way down through primary teaching of English or literacy, as it's sometimes called at primary level?
Yeah, I don't know so much about primary, but I definitely think that there are some sort of strands that are kind of have come through the whole process. So if you look at the teaching of reading, for instance, with a very strong emphasis on phonics, not on, we've lost meaning across the board, it seems to me. I mean, that, why, and the bigger picture, why are we doing these things? Why do children read? Where is the pleasure? What are they getting out of it? And equally with writing, we've lost meaning. So if you look at writing in primary schools, and I can't talk about it in the here and now, it's just the sort of the trend of what one's been able to see through the literacy strategy and beyond, SAPs, and then into the kind of emphasis on phonics. You see a trend which is all about impressing with powerful words, or how can you get a mark for doing this, or I want to see X, Y, and Z in your sentence, and all of that approach. And the same with reading, that reading is sort of broken up into tiny little segments. So meaning has got lost, and that seems to be at the heart of every intellectual endeavour. But certainly within English, everything, reading, writing, speaking and listening, it's all about people making meaning from texts, or making their own meaning through spoken or written texts. Somehow or other, the tiny little details of word level stuff, sound level stuff, proving things at a tiny micro level, all seems to have taken over from primary through.
And do you think that is because of policies? As you mentioned, the National Literacy Strategy, which did have that kind of that word level, sentence level, text level sort of way of chunking down text, if you like, coupled with things like the Key Stage 2 National Curriculum tests, the SATs tests. We used to have them at the end of Key Stage 3 in Year 9, and they are very restrictive ways of assessing English that look at very, very specific things. Do you think that has led to the situation perhaps where we are seeing a very different understanding of what English is at the different levels of teaching?
I do, and I think that assessment has driven absolutely everything, and assessment has stopped being a sort of a sampling or a slice of what's learned. It's become everything that's learned. And as a result of that, it's kind of had a knock-on effect down from Key Stage 4 into Key Stage 3 as well. It it comes back to that thing I was saying before, that if you're looking for some easy way of assessing, and you do it by the form and the formula, have, for instance, that one of the things that sort of I know has been a big concern for people is the kind of formulaic approach of PEE, point evidence exploration, or PETAL, point evidence, whatever, all kind of accumulation of acronyms that students have to just fulfill. And what's been happening is that both, not only in classrooms, but also I think for examiners, they've started to kind of get into a kind of habit of looking for the pattern and marking to the pattern. So if somebody happens to have made a point, and then they've got a bit of evidence for that point, and then they've got some kind of elaborate exploration of it, yeah, great, give them good marks in exams. And but nobody asked the question, was that a really good point? Was the evidence relevant and a particularly good bit of evidence? And then was the exploration sort of interesting, valid, authentic, useful? Or did it just bang on in some way in order to prove that exploration had been done? And I think this has sort of taken over the whole of education, really, English, education in English as a subject. Because once that starts to happen in exams, then people lower down are just sort of going through those sequences and patterns without really thinking about anything, what's under the surface of that. So I think people are, teachers are doing great stuff as well, really, really inventive and thoughtful and interesting stuff to try and counter this. Mm-hmm. But they're often having to kind of justify a very narrow way of assessing and teaching that's sort of being imposed or expected from their senior management, because that seems like an easier way of proof. It's all about proof rather than about actual learning.
Oh, absolutely. So it seems that your book then is a way of you addressing some of these issues perhaps that we're facing as a community, and I suppose picking up on that idea of ways of assessing that are maybe easier to measure, that may be entirely appropriate for other subjects that function in a different way. We come back to this idea of what matters in English, and this is kind of front and centre in your book, isn't it? That so other people who perhaps don't work within English in some capacity have imposed some ways of working that don't really work with this, and they don't reflect maybe what's at the heart of English. And you talk about quite eloquently in your book about this the accountability culture. And your Twitter list. I don't know if you had that as a way of addressing what you see as problematic practice, perhaps. Did you want to talk through some of your? And like I said, were there 10, or was it? It might have been 12.
20, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I will. I just wanted to pick up first on one thing that you were saying about the subject English having to kind of fit a pattern that is kind of broader based. And again, I'd say in the last sort of 6 to 9 months, I see sort of a few signs of good development around that, because I think people are beginning to recognise that actually subjects are very, very different, and knowledge in subjects are very different. If you apply something like the idea of truth to English, or as I said, what it's not the same as in other subjects. It's not necessarily asking the right questions. And so I have been seeing some much more positive signs of that. I mean, I think even within Ofsted, possibly more of a recognition that subject knowledge is very important, and that subjects shouldn't be distorted in order to fit a particular pattern. So that's kind of encouraging.
Absolutely.
in terms of the Twitter comments, which I printed out for myself here. So I think social media is a really, really powerful thing. I mean, it's powerful in different directions, really. It's powerful in being damaging, and it's also powerful in being able to get sort of good, interesting, important messages across. So I'm very active on social media, both for EMC and from myself personally. And I think what I did there was just to sort of pull out the other thing I was going to say is I'm also incredibly keen, as everybody who knows me knows, about a big picture. Mm-hmm. I'm always talking about the big picture, about sort of stepping back from things and sort of being able to see what's really important, what's really significant, rather than getting lost in the detail. And that's something I think we've been has been a feature of the landscape for English in education recently, is getting lost in the detail. And so Twitter is great in some ways from that point of view, because what I did was I took 20 ideas that were in the book and I just sort of put them out there really as a so I'll give you just one or two examples. Response is important before, during and after reading. So it's very crisp, and there's so much behind that, but actually it sort of addresses something that's been going on a great deal about the way in which knowledge is foregrounded before anybody reads anything, as if somehow it's impossible for you to read a text of any kind unless you know every single word in advance. And so you get great long lists of vocabulary being given to students before they ever get to a text. As if somehow or other you only get to your response right at the end when you know the text, as if it's ever possible to know a text in its entirety. How do you ever know or comprehend a 19th century novel? Or a poem for that matter? You come back at it in different ways at different times and so on. So that tiny little thing, response is important before, during and after reading. Opens up conversations, opens up debates, opens up questions, and that's what I was trying to do with these tweets, was really to open up the debate on these things.
And of course, I suppose that what that does is it gets to the knotty problem of what knowledge means in English, and again, I think I'm in agreement with you that knowledge in English is not the same as a kind of a knowledge that might be applicable to, say, STEM subjects. And I know you cover this in your book, and I know you've got talks planned for through the EMC. And you wrote about, I was particularly struck in an article that you wrote, I think, for the Chartered College of Teaching in their Impact magazine on the notion of cultural capital, because again, you referred to it there about that kind of forefronting knowledge about a text. It could be easy to spend 2 or 3 lessons giving lots and lots of information about the social or historical context of a novel, of say a 19th century novel, or any number of texts that we teach, and we end up being quite poor history teachers, I think, if we go down that route. Would you mind talking through a little bit more about why you feel the notion of cultural capital, in the way that it seems to have been commandeered perhaps by certain powers that be, that has come from the influence of E.D. Hirsch, and why that might be problematic for us as English teachers?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of huge issue, really, because it's become such a sort of it's been taken for granted. It's not been kind of questioned. The idea somehow, and also its origins in the work of Bourdieu, it's been distorted, because cultural capital for him was everything about the way we are and the way we behave culturally that gives us sort of power in the world. And he also wasn't uncritical of all of that. He wasn't sort of just, there it is, take it. But it included all sorts of things which I do think are culturally offer you capital, like the ability to debate, to discuss, to be able to hold your own in argument. Many of the things actually that are highly valued and valuable in academic circles, if you're going to go on and do English at university, for instance, much more valuable than some of what's sort of posing as cultural capital in schools, which actually boils down to about 3 or 4 different kind of iconic texts with status or ideas with status. So it's it's Homer and it's Greek myths and it's the Bible and it's Shakespeare. Well, I mean, for a start, nobody questions Shakespeare somewhere in the English curriculum, so let's put Shakespeare to one side. But the other things, I mean, somehow or other, the idea that, I mean, what do we mean by knowing the Bible? You know, teaching the Bible in English. I mean, it is useful sometimes to have access to religious text or access to the Bible, know what happened in the Garden of Eden or whatever in relation to particular texts. But you can teach those along the way. And there are a whole host of other cultural ideas and information and references that aren't those canonical ones that are equally useful. And I mean, I give the example, I think, in one of the, I can't remember where it is, but one of them, the articles I wrote about this of something like, you know, at A level, you might be studying Beloved or The Kite Runner or God of Small Things or a whole range of texts which are not based on that kind of monolithic single culture. They're based on all sorts of other things. So maybe knowing what the kind of symbolism of the pomegranate is might be just as useful to you as knowing what the symbolism of the apple is in the Garden of Eden. The point is that if you, and then another sort of point around that, if you like, is that in reading texts, they often offer you that cultural knowledge that you need, or they're the way into that cultural knowledge. So you might be reading a text that sort of teaches you about that thing. Like The Kite Runner, you learn about the pomegranate. And if there are things that you don't know, it's very, very easy for English teachers at that point, you know, where either they feel that this knowledge is necessary, or the students say, what happened in the Garden of Eden? And then there you go, you just sort of tell them it. But to build a whole curriculum around sort of certain texts that are sort of regarded as culturally powerful seems to me wrong. And then the other thing is, I just feel very much that it relates to the whole question of culture more generally. Whose culture is powerful? And it brings us back to that idea about student voices and students not having gaps and deficits and seeing them and then in that way and making them feel that that's how you see them. Because actually there are all sorts of things that I think are culturally very powerful for students, not just in their own little kind of everyday life and network, but actually beyond, that we should appreciate. So for instance, if you look at what's happening in our world now, to have read a Carla's Natives is culturally incredibly powerful for you. If you went to your university interview having said that you'd read that and you'd looked at his TV adaptation of the Odyssey, oh my goodness, isn't that powerful? Or if you know who Kate Tempest is, or if you have read one of the Booker Prize winners, Bernardine Evaristo or Margaret Atwood, wouldn't that give you enormous cultural capital? So I just think it's a ridiculous shrinking and narrowing, and does everybody a disservice to see culture in such narrow terms.
Do you think that maybe we're at a point of opportunity at the moment? There's certainly a renewed interest in the curriculum, and going back to those accountability cultures, Ofsted have now shifted their focus away from data-driven inspections to something that will look more closely at the curriculum and what is being taught. And for English, I think particularly, and maybe also for history, we have an opportunity to reevaluate what we teach in terms of texts. And I think that the current GCSE specifications have been really very narrow and very Eurocentric and quite male as well. There's been some movement around, I think edXL have introduced a couple of new texts that are maybe slightly more diverse in the last year. Do you think this is a good opportunity to have that curriculum conversation?
It's a great opportunity. I feel personally sad because I think there have been opportunities all the way through the 40 years when I've been involved with education. Those opportunities have been there and they've often not been taken. So for instance, at Key Stage 3 for the last few years, it's wide open. there's plenty of opportunity. It's just that people have been so focused on the exam at the end of Key Stage 4 that they haven't been taking that. Or, I mean, some obviously have. I don't want to say some really, really have, but many haven't. And so, yes, it's fantastic. It's a fantastic opportunity. It's wonderful that people are really interested now. And in the last couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, I've noticed on social media sort of like hundreds of people have been, not hundreds, but a lot of people have been showing an interest in EMC's publication called Diverse Shorts, because it's not only diverse shorts, it's nothing new for us. We've always incorporated and wanted to promote writing by writers of colour and very diverse, eclectic range of different writing, but people are now really, really interested in that, and I think that's just great, because it is a change. I do think that, you know, even within exam specs, where there are texts that would allow a wider range at A-level within coursework, for instance, but also within the specifications themselves, sadly, they're not always taken up very much. So for instance, one of the awarding bodies has a great module called a choice within its particular module called The Immigrant Experience, and it's got fabulous texts, but not very many. It's a minority choice. And now is a moment where maybe people might think, why is that why aren't we doing that with our group of students? Why aren't we offering that?
Okay, thank you. I want to go back and just explore a little bit more about this idea of curriculum as conversation. You refer to Appleby's work and his book with the same name. How do you think that is a helpful model for understanding how English should be taught?
Well, I love Appleby. I mean, I think every single English teacher should read Appleby. I can't believe how Hirsch has got such a reputation in this country, as compared with the American working around the same time. He's dead now, but fantastic body of work over a period of time, along with not just Appleby, but along with his collaborators, Langer, Nystrand, Gamoran. They've all done incredible work around English, which they're all Americans. They've all done amazing work that I think more people here should know about. But for me, Appleby, I mean, is just brilliant, and that book is brilliant because it brings together a whole range of things, but it's talking about English in a way that I can understand, and knowledge in English in a way that I can understand. And what it's saying is that the curriculum as a catalogue, you know, this and then this and then this, items in a catalogue, doesn't get you very far. The curriculum conversation, not in every way possible, is just is what we're all about. So it's conversations over time, conversations with the tradition and taking the tradition further forward. So giving students a sense of acting within the tradition of the English discipline and how we work. It's about doing within English. In other words, it's what have people done over time in approaching texts and textual study. And then it's conversation. So it's conversations over time. It's conversations between texts. In other words, every text is related to others. It's part of a genre. It's part of a tradition. It's subverting that tradition, or it's developing that tradition in some way. So if you're going to be constructing a curriculum, it's much, much better to be thinking, okay, thinking about those interconnections, thinking about those links and how you can carry forward the conversations. And that's then, it makes English a conceptual subject much more as well. So that just as an example, if you, maybe give you an example of something that I taught when I was teaching at City and Islington College, and was a perfect example for me of that. Those interconnected texts and what they tell you and what conversations they open up for you. So I was teaching short stories, a short story collection, a little group of things, and I taught Flannery O'Connor short stories. I love Flannery O'Connor. challenging but interesting for students. Flannery O'Connor short stories. Flannery O'Connor's writing about the nature of fiction, which is absolutely fascinating, and then that opens up for students an explicit conversation about what the short story and what fiction is. And then Alice Walker writing about Flannery O'Connor and the kind of limitations or strengths of her writing about the Deep South, and why Alice Walker loves Flannery O'Connor, despite the fact that she doesn't write much about black characters. And then Alice Walker's short stories, looking at how different they are to the Flannery O'Connor, and then starting to think about the whole question of universality versus specificity of context. So Alice Walker, Flannery O'Connor, Eudora Welty, all writing sort of regional fiction, thinking that it's important to root your fiction in a real context, and then thinking about other writers in relation to that. Mm-hmm. So that's a perfect example for me of that intertextual web and the way that the conversation takes you forward. And the same can be true for year sevens, for, you know, if they're studying a poet or little cluster of poems, if they're looking, for instance, at a few poems by Blake, they then might go on and look at another poet who's, you know, a contemporary poet who is also using symbolism, and then rather than these words being just words to be learnt in a list. Okay, you've got a list, symbolism, narrative arc, point of view, voice, you know, etc. What's the definition? Can you repeat it back to me in a quiz, in a test or whatever? It's like the air we breathe is these concepts. So, but what else would we be doing in English literature study with students and in their own writing other than be talking about, oh, isn't it interesting the way that the symbolism is being used in Blake as compared with this, as compared with that, as compared with that. That's when they really understand those words, like symbolism or point of view or voice or whatever, is when they see them enacted in texts and they understand how differently they're being used. Mm. So conversations of that kind, the interlinking of texts, the interlinking of ideas, concepts through those texts, and then the conversations that students have about them with the teacher for me, that's Appleby. Well, it's one of the many things that Appleby talks about, which I think is just so important to the subject.
Would you say, you talk about in your book that your understanding of what authentic English is, would that be a description of how you understand an authentic English to be?
Yeah, so authenticity is a really, really tricky word. I know that. Because one person's authenticity is not another's. And I know I was at a kind of university seminar fairly recently where I talked about, and we talk at English and Media Centre about real English. And I was really picked up on that by an academic who sort of felt kind of annoyed by that idea that somehow there is such a thing as real English. So I understand that's tricky, but I think we can understand it perhaps a bit by its opposite, what's inauthentic. And I think we're seeing a lot of what's inauthentic. So authenticity for me means things like validity, integrity, honesty, responsiveness, reflectiveness, engagement, commitment, criticality, meaningfulness, some of those things. And if you think of their absence, then you think about what's not authentic English. When none of those things appear, that's not authentic English for me. And so I think all of those things need to be sort of, the subject needs to be infused with them again to make it live. And one of the things that I think has been happening, because those things, the things I've just listed them here for myself: validity, integrity, honesty, reflectiveness, engagement, commitment, criticality, meaningfulness. Because they've been absent, I think students have stopped understanding what the subject is. I've stopped enjoying it. I've stopped stopped wanting to do it. And we've had a kind of a shrinking of the numbers wanting to go on and do A-level English. And people have been aware, teachers have been aware of this, have been worried about it. Many have been sort of heartbroken, really, because they've felt they've had to do the sorts of things that don't allow this. But I think we've got to go back to that. We've got to go back to some sense. So that's what English is about. That's why it's enjoyable. That's why it's pleasurable. That's what it involves. It's an effective subject, not just a subject of right and wrong answers. And when it becomes a subject of right and wrong answers, it sort of no longer really exists. So yeah, that's what I mean by authentic.
Okay, thank you. And I think at the heart of that, there seems this idea of English as a conversation, which you've talked about a lot, and Bob Eagleston has also written about it. He seeing English as a conversation. And I wondered if that was part of the drive for you for setting up the project that you've run over a number of years called "It's Good to Talk." And I know that's been a real priority for you recently. Can you talk us through what spurred you into setting up that project and what you felt you learned from it?
Yeah, so it was set up in like 2015, and it was in a period kind of at the height of really all of these sort of swings away from what I would see as authentic English. Mm-hmm. And there was a very strong voice, particularly on social media, of teachers saying it's pointless. Talk is pointless. Group work is pointless. Peer talk is pointless. Group work is pointless. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of energy. It's not cost effective was actually a term that was used. And that actually you need to do a lot of telling students things. Teachers, they need to teach. And we've seen the impact of that. I mean, it's still there. There's still people who will be arguing those things. But actually it's so counter to all the other things I've just talked about, and my own experience in the classroom of how fantastic it is to hear the things that students have to say to each other and to us and as teachers, and that, you walk into an English classroom and I would never, ever expect that every idea will be mine. And that's the joy of it, is to hear the ideas that emerge from the conversations of students. And so it seems to me sort of fundamental to the subject that there should be that kind of opportunity to talk. There were also, so that felt incredibly important to me. I mean, everything sort of emerging from the point of, from the 1960s and 70s with people like James Britton and Douglas Barnes and Harold Rosen and John Richmond. I mean, James Britton, talk is the sea on which all else floats. Mm-hmm. That seems to me to be so important. On the other hand, group work, it has to be acknowledged that group work isn't always successful. And it seemed to me to be a nonsense to sort of suggest somehow that those of us who were supporting group work somehow thought it was a panacea, that it had to be used all the time, that it was the most perfect thing and it could never fail. And, teachers should sort of step out of the arena and let students talk, merrily talk, and everything would be wonderful. Well, I mean, that's clearly a caricature of what good group work is or how it works. And so what we wanted to do in that project was to sort of explain that partly, but also investigate it, to look at what it is that does make good group work, what is it good for, and conversely, what it's not good for. How much of it should be happening, and where and when in classrooms, at what stage, before reading, before writing, after writing, pairs, bigger groups. What were the structures that would enable really good group work to happen? And also to kind of just knock on the head some of those sort of ridiculous caricatures which say if you're an advocate of group work, that means you never want teachers to say things. Nothing could be further from the truth in my mind. That group work goes along with teachers offering a huge amount. It's absolutely not an abdication of involvement by teachers or the expression of their own knowledge. So that's what we did. And we had, I mean, I would say that, you know, there were lots of side things going along the way, but the three big things we did was some initial work with two classes from two different schools who came into the English and Media Centre working on poetry, year sevens. A fantastic year seven poetry initiative with Richard Long at High Wycombe School, which just expanded and developed their own thinking so much as a department, and his own thinking as a head of department. I mean, they really ran with it in a massive way, so that it started to impact on everything that they did, and that was great. Richard wrote a blog about it, and we've got lots of documentation of what happened because of it. Started with a lesson. One lesson made a massive difference then to the whole way they were thinking about their teaching. And then the third big thing, which again I think has been quite influential, was going into a school in North London and doing some work on a novel, a year 9 cohort on a novel, and in this case we didn't want to do a randomized control trial. We couldn't really, you know, the whole project has been funded by EMC, no core funding, nothing else, just my time really, and yeah, subsidy from EMC. And with that, we did want to sort of just look at what happens if half of a cohort does one thing and another half just follows the same pattern. And they were teaching a book in The Sea There Are Crocodiles. Half of the teachers carried on in the same way that they normally did, which was very PowerPoint driven. Everybody followed the same PowerPoints. It was a lot of front-loaded knowledge about the context for the book. There was a lot of people. They just did it as they normally did. And then the other group did it completely differently. A lot more dialogic, a lot more conversations in class, a lot more responsive to the individual students and the group and how they developed, a lot more hearing what the students had to say and incorporating that into the conversation. Much bigger picture, understandings of what studying a novel is, what they wanted the students to get out of that. And so actually, certainly in the second two of those element parts of the project, the work with Richard Long and the work with the Year 9 novel, I mean, actually, the group work element of it was just like scratching the surface of what then happened, what it then opened up. So I think changing the pedagogic approach and seeing what happens, allowing students to start to talk, means that teachers then, you know, it's partly really important for the students to get the chance to think and talk together, to think aloud. It's just as important, I think, for the teachers to hear what the students both are thinking about the texts and about their learning, but also what's going on for them in terms of the learning. That sort of dialogue about what we're doing, we're in this enterprise together, and now I'm hearing actually what's going on in your lives, what you're thinking about the books, what's important to you in terms of English, and so on. So that double thing is explosive in terms of the changes it can make to people's practice.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. I think for me as an English teacher, I think some of the most exciting moments of my teaching career were when students said something I hadn't thought of, or they read something in a way that just hadn't occurred to me. And that's what makes English exciting, I guess, and dynamic to engage with as a subject. Now, obviously, you're not just a provider of training for teachers of English, but you're also a published writer, and you've published a number of novels. And I know you've got some short stories coming out later this year.
Yeah.
How important do you feel it is to have those two things going alongside each other? Because often, and particularly as I work with many PGCE students who many of them come from a literature background, which is heavily analytical, and maybe they're not very confident in teaching writing, particularly at secondary level, getting students to write. how have you managed to kind of balance those two things, and how important is it, do you feel, to be a writer of fiction or poetry alongside doing the analysis?
I think it's incredibly helpful. And I mean, on our courses at EMC, we're often asking teachers to do tiny little bits of writing themselves, whether it's critical or creative, because actually all sorts of things go out the window when they do that. I mean, for instance, if you do a sort of critical writing work in a session, a CPD session, and you look at what happens about the way people plan, they don't do what they ask their students to do. I mean, mostly for instance, with planning something, for me certainly, but for a lot of people, other people I think as well, what you do is you have a very rough sketch of what you think you're going to do. And then as you write, I mean, this is true for literary writing as well as analytical writing, what you write emerges to some extent through the writing process, and you don't sort of end up where you thought you were going to. You think as you write. Writing is thinking. Mm-hmm. Right, basically writing is thinking. And so if teachers haven't had that experience, or they don't regularly do that, they forget those things, or they haven't really kind of internalized those things. So I think it's really, really helpful to do both in terms of teaching. And I think opportunities for teachers to, I mean, it's such an enjoyable thing to do as well, but in its own right. So that idea that they do something like that, they write in their own, for its own sake, as adults, enjoy that, and then they reflect back on what impact that has on the way they might then teach, that they might teach writing. So yes, I think that's really, really important. The other thing about it, of course, is that I think that, and it's why I'm so glad that there's been more of an emphasis now on the subject and on subject knowledge, is that it feels to me incredibly important that teachers should have a rich intellectual life of their own that is fueled by their teaching, and vice versa. Their intellectual life fuels their teaching, their teaching fuels their intellectual life. Because actually that's what makes you want to be a teacher, to stay in the classroom, to have a career in teaching, is if the two come together in that sort of way. And so, and I very much think, and this would go for early years through primary through into secondary, that I think that the engagement with young people in their learning is intellectually highly demanding and incredibly important. It's I chose to do this, not to become an academic. I know I'm not dissing academics, but I chose to do it partly for the intellectual fascination of how it is that people learn, and how you can offer some of what's been really important to you to other people. So maintaining that intellectual life and interest in the subject seems to me to be both incredibly important for teachers as a way of continuing their own interest and thinking in the subject, but also for what they do in the classroom.
Thank you. And obviously the English and Media Centre, there's a long history of supporting English teachers and media teachers, who are often one and the same, but not always, in supporting their continuing professional development. And recently, obviously, things have had to move online. How have you felt about running CPD online, and what are the plans for the future for EMC?
Right. Well, we were tentative at first, and I think it was me who sort of put my toe in the water initially and said, because we were going to have a conference that's been postponed around what matters in English teaching, the book. And I thought, well, it would be quite nice to sort of, partly because I'm sort of really, really keen to sort of get out some of these ideas at this particular moment. I thought it might be interesting to have a go at sort of doing something as CPD on that. And it was just incredible, the numbers of people who've now come to that session. I've repeated it 3 times. And it does mean that we're reaching a lot of teachers who couldn't sort of travel and couldn't get release, and that's just great. And I think it's been highly appreciated that offer's been there. And we've got lots more to along those sort of lines, other members of the EMC staff are offering a lot of CPD of different kinds. Some of them more presentational, some of them more like a traditional course. We've been doing them at different times of day and evening to try and sort of reach people. I mean, and it's also partly because of obviously a kind of very practical thing, which is that English and Media Centre is a not-for-profit with no core funding, and we do get quite a bit of our income from courses, and we really do need to generate some income from this also to survive. So it's not, so far it's not been massively expensive. It's been cheap actually, but we've had to charge. We can't sort of do it for free. In terms of the doing of it, it's been really fascinating actually. It's a kind of, I mean, I know I did something for you, Rachel. But it's a really sort of interesting trying. Well, one thing is that my normal pattern is very dialogic. I mean, in terms of CPD and so forth. I mean, obviously there's an element of presentation, but it's always with group work and discussion and people coming back at you, etc. And on Zoom, it's not very dialogic in theory, but I've been working quite hard at trying to put in some kind of interactive elements to it. And the chat is really fascinating, the written chat. And in some ways, I mean, both the kind of requirement to be more presentational and the way in which you get the sort of dialogue and the responses and the use of polling and the offer of very small interactive elements that people can try out has been quite instructive. I mean, I don't know, people who've been to the sessions would have to put their view on how it works. But I've thought it would work pretty well, and I've enjoyed that kind of, like, I've been able to watch the chat while I've been talking, and I've seen what people have said, and I've sometimes been able to then incorporate that in, in relation to what that person said, this. So yes, I mean, it's forcing us to be more inventive, imaginative, do things slightly differently, but not necessarily in every way worse.
Yes, and I think this kind of new normal that we're working under at the moment, everyone's having to think of how to make teaching virtually something that will work. It's never going to be the same as teaching face to face. Do you have any, this is my kind of final question really, do you have any advice then, or any tips for either people who might be watching this who are maybe thinking about moving into English teaching, or have just starting out on their teaching career as English teachers?
Okay, so I think one, like, again, this is very big picture. I think that you need to remember that you're coming into a profession at a moment in time, and that what you encounter is what's happening at that particular moment. But it wasn't like that in the past, and it won't be like that in the future. So what you have to have is some kind of rudder, some kind of steer that steers you through the waters in your journey, through your career. And that rudder will be a set of core principles and ideas, hopefully that you get in your training, but that you will get through reading about pedagogy, reading about subject, reading people who you respect and admire, going to CPD, etc., and that give you a way of kind of finding your route through and thinking about whether what is happening now is what you want it to be. And given that that thing we were saying previously about agency, I'd also recommend that you find friends, you find networks and other people who are like-minded. I mean, for instance, the subject associations, English Association, NATE, LATE, all offer, English and Media Centre, all offer a kind of way of thinking or a route through or a sense of what's important, that even if you can't implement all those things in your own school because you feel you don't have the power, or it's hard to argue, persuade, you have that kind of network who can support you. And I would also say within your context, and this is for heads of English as well, actually, not just for early career teachers, that it's important to try to take on some of these issues, to try to wrest control back to a certain extent, to explain to people coming into your lessons what English is, to not allow them to judge your department on the basis of a kind of map for learning that doesn't apply to English, to ask them when they come into a lesson and observe you, to think about the content, the knowledge, and what's special about it, not just looking at the formulae and how they're being achieved and so on. So those are kind of key things that I would recommend. And just thinking about, keep in touch with the subject, keep in touch with what's going on in the subject. I mean, reading academic writing, reading e-magazine, seeing what academics are saying that's current is really important for me. I mean, it's very easy to sort of start to kind of go stale on the new developments in a subject. I loved medieval literature at university. That's what I'd have done if I had to ever do research. But what people were saying about Chaucer in those days is not what they're saying about Chaucer now. And so it's kind of invigorating for your students and for you to keep abreast of what's happening right now in the subject.
Thank you so much, Barbara. It's been really fascinating to talk to you.
Thank you. You've been lovely to talk to.